Today it is a real thrill and honor for me to have a conversation with Justice Grace Mumbi Ngugi, who I came to know during my first visit here to Kenya in Nairobi. She is an extraordinary trailblazer, having been a lawyer, then a judge on the High Court, and now a justice on the Court of Appeals, and the co-founder of the Albinism Foundation for East Africa. Welcome, welcome, Justice.
Thank you very much, Justice Williams.
So we want to start, people think that judges and justices somehow are born with a black robe as their first onesie or a gavel as their first toy. But your story really begins on Banana Hill with your 11 brothers and sisters. Tell us how you grew up and how your parents inspired you to be the student you were, to be the lawyer you ended up being, and to be the judge you are today.
Yes, thanks. I think growing up in Banana Hill, I didn't for one moment think that I would be where I am today. As a middle child of 11 children, 5 brothers, 6 sisters, going to a rural school, trying to navigate the difficulties of being a different child. I think my initial thoughts then were to survive in the village, to get on in school despite having visual challenges that made it difficult to study easily. And so I think that the last thing those days in my mind were becoming a judge. But then as I grew older, I found that I could do well in school, and I began to dream a little more, and I thought I could go to the university. And my big sister was a student at Makerere University, and she would wear this academic robe, and I would look at her photographs and think, someday I think I should like to go to Makerere, and I would like to wear that kind of robe. And for me, that's where the ambition to be something other than just this little girl in the village with albinism began to grow. And with time, I went to the university and I became a lawyer. And I thought the best thing to do is get into practice and see how you defend rights. I got into the women's rights movement. I got into the movement for protecting rights of the urban poor. And after that, I got into protecting the rights of children and children with albinism. But I still didn't think about becoming a judge until probably after the 2010 Constitution, when it was then possible to apply, be interviewed, and present myself as a candidate whom the Judicial Service Commission then thought was viable. And then here I am, 10 years later.
Here you are,
Yes.
10 years later. I mean,
Yes.
and I want to go back to that time that you mentioned in the village, a child with albinism. Share with us some of the things that happened to you or the way people treated you because of that condition.
Okay, I think you're white. I was a white child in Black community. Albinism is a rare enough condition that most people haven't seen anybody with albinism. I had a brother also who had albinism. So it was basically the two of us in my village. It's called Banana Hill, is a neighboring village called Mushada. There's Kikuyu on the other side. So that we were just like the two of us. And people are not very kind, whether they're adults or children. Children can be particularly cruel because, unlike adults, they will not hide what they're thinking. So walking to and from school sitting in class with other students, you would always get these things said about you. Their favorite word, of course, was mzungu. The ones who knew what albinism was, they would call you albino. And I think it developed a lifelong distaste for the word albino, so that I always felt like people just saw your condition. They didn't see the person behind it. So as I grew older, I began to make an emphasis on talking about the person, a person with albinism, rather than an albino. Because for me, it sounded a bit like you're talking about wildlife, You talk about a rhino or an elephant, an albino, something that doesn't have a spirit, a soul, somebody who gets hurt, who has feelings. And so it was pretty difficult.
And it was in, some people believe that, I don't know, having, talk about spells or, that there's some magical power in people with albinism. And so people were also physically hurt. That didn't happen to you. People didn't try to take your hand or take some, but that's happened in some cultures, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Interestingly, when I was growing up, and I think up till about 2000, 2007, I had not heard of anybody saying that people with albinism have magical powers. I first heard about it on BBC. I used to listen a lot to BBC. And I'd hear about these ritual murders that are taking place in Tanzania and Malawi. And it became really widespread. And I think because of the kind of things that were said about it, that the hair and the limbs of a person with albinism will make you rich, it spread quite a bit. And I think quite a lot of children in Tanzania, Malawi, probably Mozambique were maimed because of that, and some were killed. In Kenya, it didn't happen, although there were cases of people being abducted, 1 or 2 people being abducted from Kenya, transported across the border to Tanzania. So in my youth, when I was growing up, that wasn't there. I cannot tell you how it started, where it came from. What I do know is that there have always been superstitions about albinism. In Kiswahili, the word they use is a very derogatory term, zeru, like something that was exchanged by the devil for a real one. So when people have that kind of thinking about you, it's very easy to move from seeing you as this object to an object that they can make money out of. So luckily, that didn't happen. The physical maiming, the physical harming didn't happen. The spiritual maiming, the psychological harm from negative words, insults, the belief that you cannot be anything worthwhile, that happened a lot. It was difficult for mothers, for women who were abandoned by their spouses because they gave birth to this child. But the physical maiming that happened a lot in Tanzania didn't happen here. So to that extent, we were lucky here.
But there were lessons, like even in, I think it was when you were going from 6th level, you scored, 35 or 36, one of the highest scores in the school. You studied very hard as a young girl. What kept you going? How did you hold on, even in the face of all of that?
When you get into a situation like when I did when I went into primary school, and the children are laughing at you and saying good things about you, and they won't let you pass peacefully, I think you have 2 choices. You can give up, or you can fight. For me, the easier thing, I think the only option was really to fight. So first, when I was very young, probably in class 1 or 2, it was a physical fight. You have bullies, and they won't let you play in the field. So you can keep running away, or you can stand up and fight. I suspect the person I fought with beat me. I don't think I was that strong. But the fact that I was able to stand up and say, you can't just push me around all the time, that helped a lot. The second thing is, you realize that you can do well with education. There were a lot of books. I'd started reading a lot of books early. I'd pick my older brother and sister's books and read a lot of things. And you realize that you're doing well in school. So when that happens, people begin to respect you. They begin to say, this, you can't beat this girl, she's doing well. And that helped really a great deal. So you sort of find something that you can do really well. You ignore the things that you can't see. For instance, that you can't do. I realized I didn't see very well, so I couldn't be good in sports. I could stay in the sun for too long, but I could sit in class and read my books, read my notes, internalize a lot of things, so that exams, were easy. And going to a good school was easy. Yeah.
And then you didn't even realize, in terms of your vision, what the issue was for a while, right?
Yes. What I did know is that I couldn't say well. It was terrible being out in the sun. And for those who went to rural schools those days, like in the 70s when I was in school, in primary school, a lot of activities for children were outside. So we'd be out there. You'd be told, to write strange things, maybe on the sand or on your skin. Because if you're dark, you can actually use a stick and write stuff on your skin. But of course, I couldn't do that. And then I knew I had great difficulties walking outside. And my parents, my mother especially, took me to a doctor who didn't quite know what was wrong with my eyes. And the knowledge that we have now about glasses with photochromatic lenses, that wasn't there then. So the doctor, I remember, just wrote for my mother, just buy her sunglasses. Of course, my mother wasn't a very educated woman. In the 70s, early 70s, you didn't know anything about sunglasses. So for a long time, I had no visual help. Eventually, I think I got glasses when my older sister, became a nurse, and she worked with an ophthalmologist called Dr. Awan, and then she told the doctor about her little sister with albinism. Then that's when I went and saw that doctor, and I think I got my first pair of glasses when I was 18. It doesn't correct your vision totally because of the lack of pigmentation. It's a lifelong thing. But it helps a great deal to protect your eyes from the sun, to help you a little more with the vision. So it took a long time. 18 is a long time to be without a visual aid. But the good thing is you learn how to cope with the situation. Instead of looking at the blackboard, you listen a great deal,
So your listening skills are excellent. Clearly, because you did so well in school. I mean, at every level you exceeded. It's just, to me, such a tribute to your determination and your recognition that education was so important, and you went 18 years without glasses. I want to finish this, and we're going to come back to this, but I do want to get to how you co-founded the Albinism Foundation for East Africa.
Okay, again, I have to link this again with growing up. Because the only thing that you saw or heard about albinism, whether in the media or anywhere else, was something negative. All these children, they will get skin cancer, they will die young, they cannot complete education. something that was always negative. And at some point, I thought, wait, that can't be the entire story. There must be something more. And by the time we started the Albinism Foundation, I had already qualified as a lawyer. I linked up with other people with albinism, and we started reaching out to other people with albinism, to the parents of children with albinism, to children with albinism. First, to the children themselves, just to give many of them a sense that, look, we are here. I must have been 30 or 40 when we started doing this. And we are here. We've made it. You can go to school. You can do well. Reaching out to the mothers, telling them it's not your fault. This is a genetic thing. It happens all over the world, not just to us in Kenya, but around the world. Reaching out to the fathers and telling them, it isn't that your wife was unfaithful. It just happens that she was a carrier of the recessive gene that causes albinism. You also were a carrier of the recessive gene. Together, you get a child with albinism. So do not blame her. And I think the more we communicated, the more we talked about this with parents, with children, with friends, we managed to get a lot of information going. And luckily for me, I had friends. One of my first employers, a gentleman called Zul Nimji, whom I really respect, supported us a lot in getting sunscreen and glasses for children with albinism. My friend Dr. Choksi, an ophthalmologist, she's still doing some wonderful work with children with albinism, checking their eyes. We started helping with education because what we found is that a lot of children with albinism end up being in single-parent households where the mothers can't afford school fees. So we help to educate a lot, and that's still going on. So the fact that we were able to get a core group of people with albinism, friends of people with albinism, to start this thing together. I think now I can say in 2007, maybe just a few people would stand up and say, I have albinism and I'm a lawyer or I'm a teacher. Because there was a tendency to make people with albinism feel like they should be ashamed of themselves, like they had something to do with their condition. Now people can say, this is me. I didn't have anything to do with what I am. This is genetics. Take me as I am. My brain is what works. It's nothing to do with my skin, sort of thing. So we have a lot of young people now doing pretty well. So I think in the 10, almost 15 years that since we started that organization, I think we have made considerable changes in giving information, in changing attitudes. Not as much as I think we can do. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think we have made considerable change at individual level for people, and I think also in the wider community.
Yeah, it really is quite extraordinary what you and the organization have been able to accomplish. One more thing about childhood. Your parents were always very supportive of you.
Yes.
So talk about them as role models. I know they weren't educated, but what did they believe? What in their beliefs has helped keep you going each day?
I think for many parents, especially in our communities who were not very educated, albinism, the whole question of genetics, was a very strange thing. So like my mother, I think she married very young. Her second child had albinism, my big brother. And of course, the whole community wasn't very kind. My brother was born during the state of emergency in Kenya in the 50s. So between your neighbors who are not very kind, between the colonial guards who think that, what are you doing with a white child? Have you been running around with a foreigner? It was very difficult for her. But what she did, and what she always did, is to dedicate herself. Never mind what people say. I will look after my children. I will take care of them. Where education is needed, I will give it to her. My father, I think, might have known of some relatives in his larger family who had albinism. So I guess it wasn't as much of a shock like it must have been for my mother. But for him, it was also encouraging you to do the best you can. My father, from a very early age, sort of developed a reward system. You do well in school, I'll give you a prize. So if you became number 1, 2, or 3, you got a prize. You got a book, you got something.
Yeah.
So you always knew that at the end of every time, if you do well, you'll get a prize. And then if you pass well, I remember my father would drive to my school in Nyeri. He would be there at 8 a.m. to pick me up from school because he didn't want me to take the matatu because it would be difficult for me. Mm-hmm. So my sister and I, my sister didn't have albinism, but he would pick us up both early in the morning. When we were going back to school, he'd either take us or the father of another friend would take us. So he was always supportive in terms of what you need as a student, making sure that you're protected to and from school, so that I always knew that for my father, so long as I do well, he will pay my school fees, he will give me a reward for becoming number 1 or 2. And for a child, that's a very great thing. When I did my O-levels, I think, and I did very well, I might have been among the top or the top in my school. I got a radio when you're a young girl and you get a radio,
That was everything.
Yes, it was a rare thing to get then. So I was very excited about that.
So with this background and with your parents' emphasis on education and you doing so well, ultimately you got your bachelor's of laws from University of Nairobi, then you got a master's of law, an LLM in commercial and corporate law. How did you decide you wanted to be a lawyer? Because growing up in Banana Hill, there weren't any lawyers. You didn't know a lawyer. You didn't know a judge. How did you decide law was your calling?
Okay, sometime just about the time I was going to do my primary education exam, Justice IAWL was appointed the first woman magistrate. And for some reason that I'm not quite sure I remember why, my father brought the newspaper. He knew I used to like reading newspapers. So he brought that newspaper with Justice IAWL as the first magistrate. And I suspect that planted the seed of interest in the law for me. But then I went to school and I liked literature. And I thought, perhaps I should go and do a degree in Bachelor of Education and then go into journalism. But when we came to filling the university papers, I think I might have been bullied a little by my teachers into selecting law. I wasn't sure that that's what I wanted to do. But I think once I got into it, I realized it's a powerful area. It's something that one can use to advance a lot of things. I may not have, captured everything in my mind at that point at the university about the power of the law to change society. But I think the seeds of that were planted around that time. And of course, once you get out of the university and you start looking and reading about other things, then you realize the potential of the law to change lives for women, for minorities, for groups that were marginalized. And I think that helped a great deal when now I came into practice, so that even if I didn't get into the mainstream of human rights work immediately, I was able to combine that with the kind of practice that would earn me a living, while at the same time helping to advance other areas.
And so you went into private practice.
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Yes.
And in fact, it was while you were in private practice that we had the privilege of meeting, because you were really active in FIDA, and I had the privilege of doing trial advocacy training to you, Martha Comey, Ann Amati, like all these women that are like running Kenya today. It's just amazing. Yes. And FIDA had called to you, and you took that advocacy course. Why? Why did you think that was important? And FIDA, why did FIDA take so much time? And why did you give FIDA so much time?
You know, the 90s were a very interesting time for Kenya. I don't know whether many people know, but up till about 1997, sex was allowed in the Constitution as a ground of discrimination. So you could pass legislation that discriminated against women. So since about 1992, we had been talking about making sure that we have legislation that discriminated against women removed. And so for many women, it was a natural thing to join the Federation of Women Lawyers and to work towards advancing the rights of women, towards removing discriminatory legislation, towards changing the customary laws and attitudes that discriminated against women. At the same time, I was involved with organizations like Kituo Sharia, where you had a lot of people who needed advocacy and education on their labor rights, their housing rights. I worked with an organization in a place called Dandora in Kenya, where a lot of the poor people living in the slum areas were women. And you needed not just to tell them about their rights, but also to do litigation that helps the courts, the judicial system, start to protect their rights also. And it was necessary to acquire the necessary advocacy skills to do that. And what better way than the training that we got from NITA to help us do those cases? Because you realize a lot of us didn't have much training in advocacy. You finished law school, you went and did pupillage, you learned on the job. Many of us didn't have any formal training in trial advocacy. So you knew the law, you picked up things from the senior advocates. Maybe there were good techniques, some were not. So it was really, I think, a great blessing to get the kind of training that NITA was doing in conjunction with FIDA and other organizations, because that helped us a great deal in doing the kind of cases that we were doing for women and other groups, like the community groups whose houses were being demolished in the slum settlements. So that really was a great.
You took that course, and then with Lawyers Without Borders and NITA, we offered a training of training course, which you took. And then I cannot even remember, Justice, how many trainings I invited you back to when we were training magistrates, prosecutors, other lawyers who were human rights advocates, and you always said yes. Why do you feel such a strong obligation to give back? You were first in so many ways, but you don't want to be the last. Why is giving back so important?
I've always felt the need to make things better, not just for myself. I may not have had very many mentors initially, but having been blessed with the opportunities that I had that are not very open to very many people, then I think it was important to create another level of young women who can then pass on the education, the mentorship that is necessary. Because even though many of us have done reasonably well in the profession, many women have done reasonably well in getting an education, there are still so many others out there who need the kind of advocacy skills that they can then use to make a change in their communities. There are very many women who need to come after us and be the mentors and the role models for the many young people who are coming up today. Today, when I see a young girl with albinism or a young girl in a rural village who can barely get an education, I know that there's still a great deal to be done. I don't know whether there's a time we can ever say, now we have achieved everything and now we don't need to give back to our communities. I think the world doesn't change easily for the better. I'd like to think a lot has changed for the better, but I still think there's still a great deal more to be done for women, for children, in the slums of the city, even in middle-class homes where sometimes girls are not as confident as they should be, where parents still don't believe as much in their young women as they ought to. So for as long as the world remains the way it is, I think there will always be a need to mentor, to educate, to give back,
So that you are still continuing to fight the fight by giving back and doing all these things. You, in FIDA, you had something to do with different laws that were passed, lobbying to protect the rights of people who I would say are voiceless and who are unrepresented and unable to protect themselves. Share some of that, because that Sexual Offenses Act, I know, is something you worked on. And what are some of the other initiatives?
One of the things that we really worked on in FIDA, in collaboration with the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, that's not the governmental, but the NGO, and the Equal Rights Trust of the UK, was an initiative to try and pass equality and non-discrimination legislation in Kenya. Because the lack of equality, the discrimination against different groups for various reasons are really what bring a lot of people down. When you discriminate against girls in the area of inheritance, in the area of education, when you discriminate against communities because of where they come from, when you discriminate against women on the basis of their status, whether they are married or not, whether they are single mothers, you deny them the opportunities either for education or economic empowerment. So we really worked a great deal on that. It did come to fruition because eventually Parliament did not take it up. But something even greater happened. We passed the 2010 Constitution, where FIDA and other civil society organizations were really active in agitating for the equality provisions that are contained in Article 27 of the Constitution. So even though we didn't get the legislation, which I hope ultimately will be passed because we need to spell out certain things that cannot be spelled out in the Constitution. We have Article 27. And with that article, and as a judge now, I'm able to use that article and say you cannot discriminate against women or against children or against even LGBT communities on the basis of their status. So we may not have managed to get the legislation enacted, but we have managed to get in the Constitution a very good provision that as judges we are now able to use to say to the state, to say to the employers, you cannot discriminate against this person on the basis of these grounds because these grounds are prohibited in the Constitution. Maybe ultimately that legislation will be passed, but even if it isn't, we have been able to find in our Constitution very strong provision that can protect one of the key areas that as FIDA, Kituo cha Sheria, Kenya Human Rights Commission were working on in the run-up to the 2010 Constitution. And for me, that was a great achievement. Immediately after my appointment, I was placed in the Constitutional and Human Rights Division. I think it was quite a challenge because we had this new constitution that said in one of the articles that anyone had the right to bring a petition alleging that there's a threat, there's a violation, or a threat of violation of their fundamental rights.